with this microphone, and turns out no one heard that, so it's perfect. Um, well, anyways, yeah, thanks, Leon, for organizing this and for having me. As Leon mentioned, I'll give a very brief and I would say a shallow overview of machine learning. It will be a very basic lecture. I know that some people perhaps already have some experience with machine learning and other people do not. So for the purpose of this course, since this isn't in particular a machine learning course, we made sure that this is a kind of this lecture doesn't assume that you know anything about machine learning going into it. So just for a brief introduction, my name is Kiret. I'm a postdoc at the brain simulation section. My background is in both brain-computer interfacing and also machine learning for medicine. There we go. So just to briefly outline some goals for this session, like I said, I'm not assuming any prior knowledge about machine learning. So for some, it'll be very basic. The first goal, of course, is just to acquire a conceptual understanding of basic machine learning. And specifically, I talk about classification because that is kind of one of the main applications of machine learning. And most commonly, when people are using machine learning, they're using it for classification problems. And I will explain a little further what classification means. We'll talk about how to understand and how to construct a valid classification pipeline and why each piece of that pipeline is important in terms of the validity and accuracy of the results. And we'll use a demo to go over how to write a basic pipeline and how to interpret the results of your machine learning experiments. So just a brief outline of how we're going to cover all of those topics. So first, we'll just touch on some basic machine learning concepts and types of applications. We'll go into some methodology and we won't have time to go into all of the details and all of the different ways machine learning is done or all of the different types of algorithms. The main goal is more to talk about how to actually apply machine learning in a very basic way to problems that are already well suited for simple machine learning experiments. And then at the end, we'll go through a demo so you can actually see what it looks like. So let's just jump into some basic machine learning concepts. For those of us in the more applied sciences or in the sciences in general, where we're using machine learning to sort of analyze our data in a more statistical sense, as opposed to people who are more machine learning researchers per se, I would suggest that it's actually more useful to think of machine learning as a class of statistical methods and tools that are specialized for pattern recognition. So for our purposes, machine learning is much more similar to something like linear regression and logistic regression as compared to self-driving cars and robotics and things like that. Underlying all of those types of applications, there's a lot of commonality in terms of the machine learning methods used, and the concepts are not altogether different. But in terms of using machine learning in the neurosciences, we're more talking about things like regression analyses and clustering and classification. So what's different about machine learning in particular, though, is that instead of defining some kind of function as in linear regression, where you have a linear equation and you want to fit your beta coefficients, machine learning is being used to fit a function, in particular the coefficients of a function, to solve some kind of similar problem. But the function itself might not be knowable. So we can't write the function beforehand, and we might not be able to write the function after the fact as well. Broadly speaking, machine learning is subdivided into two main categories. So unsupervised learning, which we won't discuss in too much detail, is really about trying to categorize data based only on input data. So your data are not labeled in any way. So if we had data from several hundred patients at the Charité, we would have no diagnostic information about those patients. Instead, we would take a look at what data we have or what variables we have about those patients and try to identify whether there are distinct clusters within that population. Um, and most machine learning that we talk about these days falls under the definition of supervised learning. And in this case, you actually have labels for your data. So using the same example, you have a population of patients at the Charité, but this time you maybe have diagnostic labels or some kind of clinical scores. And that would allow you to perform classification or regression on those data. So just to give a brief description about what these three types of problems are, these three application areas. When it comes to classification, the idea is we have data or patients or what have you that are subdivided into different categories, and these are the labels that are given. Given some data set belonging to that population, we want to identify a boundary in our abstract feature space or variable space, whereby we can optimally separate or identify which patients or data points belong to which category. So shown here, and I don't know if you can see my mouse cursor, I suppose possibly not, but in the example or the illustration given here, we have a binary classification problem. So there are two classes. Perhaps these are healthy controls versus patients with Alzheimer's disease. And that would, given some clinical information about these, we want to identify in this data space, what is a boundary that separates healthy controls and patients with Alzheimer's disease. Then when we have new patients coming in and we collect similar clinical data about them, we can classify them simply by mapping them into this data space and identifying on which side of that boundary they lie on. And that tells us the likelihood or the predicted answer in terms of whether they have Alzheimer's disease or they're a healthy control. Regression. Oh, thanks. Regression, on the other hand, rather than trying to find distinct categories of data points, you're instead trying to fit a model that explains or a curve or something that explains the data and minimizes the distance between the points and the model itself. I think everyone is fairly familiar with regression, since everyone would have had to take some statistics course at some point in their career, I would hope. And machine learning is really just provides a different set of tools to perform regression analyses. In particular, a lot of machine learning-based regression analyses allow for non-linearity. And that, of course, comes at the cost of interpretability, because, like I said in the beginning, we might not be able to actually be able to write the function as a mathematical equation. So it's hard to then interpret what variables best explain the model and to identify either correlative or causal relationships between inputs and outputs. Clustering, on the other hand, like I mentioned before, it is similar to classification in that we're trying to identify subcategories or different regions in which populations or data points are clustered, but we don't have an actual ground truth set of labels to use in terms of fitting the model. Instead, what the model needs to do is typically, but not always, but typically use distances and the densities of point clouds in order to estimate how many clusters there are and where those clusters lie and which data points are most statistically likely to belong to each cluster. So pretty much all actual machine learning applications are some combination of these three statistical tools, and that allows us to build things like self-driving cars and do all sorts of interesting robotics things. So, of course, some people might be wondering, well, what is the connection to TVB here? Well, Leon in the last lecture talked about how one can use MATLAB and Python in order to actually analyze the outputs of TVB experiments. And machine learning is one of those, or a set of tools that can allow you to further analyze those very outputs. And in particular, allows you to do certain kinds of analyses, like make use of TVB outputs that were perhaps run on different types of patients with different diagnoses to help aid classification. And that, of course, is in the reading for today. We provide an example of how we did that in our lab. And there might be other uses of TVB or machine learning in TVB as well. For example, I think we've already covered parameter exploration. One could formulate parameter exploration as a regression problem for TVB, and there may in fact be ways to make parameter exploration more efficient using machine learning methods so that you don't actually have to sample the whole space, and instead using some kind of regression and gradient descent method, we may be able to find the optimal parameter setting in fewer steps. And like I mentioned, categorizing types of neural activity or regions of neural patterns could be construed as a clustering problem. And classifying disease states, which is the most kind of obvious example, would be an example of classification using TVB outputs. And I would just like to say that this is a relatively fresh area for exploration, and there's probably a lot of different types of applications that could be done in this space that just simply haven't really been explored yet. So it'll be interesting to see what different people come up with here. Okay, so that just gives a very high level and brief overview on some basic machine learning concepts and how machine learning is actually used. Let's talk about in a little more detail how we actually solve these kinds of problems. And I know Leon already mentioned, but please feel free to ask questions in the chat if something doesn't make sense as I'm going through it. So a big area of machine learning, or the success of machine learning, that I think is underemphasized in most areas, is the fact that we don't just need big data, but we actually need high quality data for machine learning to be successful. So there is this basic idea of garbage in, garbage out. And in some ways that may even apply more to machine learning than to regular statistics. So there are a lot of different models of what actually determines good data quality, but some basic things is that your data actually need to be representative of the population or subpopulation that you're trying to study in the first place. So if statistically the data set you have, I mean, we'll continue with this example of healthy controls and Alzheimer's disease. If statistically your sample of Alzheimer's patients isn't very representative of the actual broader population of Alzheimer's patients, if you train a model and then go to try and apply it clinically outside of that particular setting in which it was trained, you're almost surely going to fail in some sense, because essentially your model is relying on there being statistical similarity between new data and the data that was used for training. Accuracy is a similar concept, except that in the clinical world and also outside of the clinical world, there are often errors in data, or even just missing data, and this can affect the kind of statistical similarity between data that has been used for training and data that can come in from other clinics or from the same clinic but in the future that you might want to use for diagnosis. Cleanliness of the data is also, a really big issue. There's a lot of noise, particularly, I mean, in neuroscientific data, we deal with a poor signal to noise ratio all of the time. So for example, with the EEG, you always have issues around volume conduction, and just the fact that most of the neural activity you're seeing is maybe not necessarily related or relevant for the particular machine learning application you have in mind. So somehow dealing with the fact that data in the clinical world and real world data in general can be quite messy. The cleaner the data, the more reliable the data, the more accurate the data, the more representative the data you can get, the more successful you're likely to be in this space. Another consideration is that you need to have good modeling. And good modeling in this sense, I don't just mean having good, powerful algorithms or something like that. What I really am talking about is good data science practice. So there are sometimes in certain fields a trend towards plugging in the most powerful model or the most powerful algorithm, like really fancy deep learning techniques to solve very simple problems. And typically this is not really the best way to go. So in general, you want to avoid overcomplication. We should usually seek out the simplest solution to a problem that allows us to adequately address that problem. And one of the reasons is that simplicity kind of lends itself to interpretability a little bit more. And in addition to that, it's a bit easier to actually evaluate the performance of your models when you're using simpler models, and to understand what they're doing and why, and to adapt them to different situations, and to apply them more broadly, like testing in different clinics or using them in different settings. And another aspect of good modeling practice is just having statistically sound evaluation techniques. And I mean, that's an area that we will emphasize today. And one of the reasons I actually mentioned this is because when I'm doing my peer review for different machine learning journals or engineering journals, I would say one of the main reasons papers that apply machine learning get rejected is because the evaluation techniques used to estimate performance and report performance and interpret performance are actually not very statistically sound. So it's actually, I would say, a fairly big problem in the field right now. So that just covers kind of what we need in terms of some data and some basic data science practice. Now let's talk about kind of more the actual hands-on meat and bones, meat and potatoes, sorry, of actually doing machine learning. And the first topic, of course, is working with feature space. And in this case, there is often more to working with feature spaces than just pre-processing. But as we're trying to keep things simple, we'll just talk about basic pre-processing for now. So to go over a very basic setup for a classification problem, we have our matrix X, which would be a set of samples. So perhaps each row in your matrix is a sample or a patient, and a set of columns where each column is a variable, which we in the machine learning world call features. And your features might be different clinical scores, height and weight and gender and things like that of your patient. And all of these things are perhaps related to some diagnosis you're trying to make or some score you're trying to give to the patients, and perhaps they're not related at all. We don't know a priori which features are actually relevant and which are not. In addition to this data matrix, we also have a label matrix, or sorry, a label vector, I should say. And a label vector just gives us for each sample in our data, what category does it belong to? Or in other words, for each patient in our data set, what diagnosis is attributed to them. And then this is used for training and testing our model. So before we can actually train an algorithm, most of the time we need to perform something called feature scaling. And so why do we actually need to scale our features in the first place? Basically, the main reason is that many algorithms, and I might even say most algorithms used for classification and different kinds of machine learning problems are based on the distances between points. And because it's based on the distances between points, when your different variables have different scaling factors. So for example, um, um, age might range from something like 30 to 80, whereas the proportion of time spent watching TV, which might be a clinically relevant variable, would be a 0 to 1 variable or something like that. Now this age variable just being higher in values in general can over-influence the model because it contributes more to the distance between points than a variable that's scaled from 0 to 1. And so that's typically where the problem lies when it comes to differently scaled features. There are some other considerations for scaling which are maybe less important in the sense that they wouldn't kind of completely prevent your model from learning anything. And one example of that is just that for certain types of convergence algorithms in machine learning, particularly gradient descent, you would usually have more efficient model convergence when your data are scaled so that they're kind of all in the same range. And you can see an illustration of that here in the corner that just shows that the stability of gradient descent algorithms is just greater when you have your data scaled and doesn't jump around so much. In addition, there's something called the saturation effect in neural networks, which has to do with the activation function that's used, and just higher values just raise that activation level for a neuron. And so when your data aren't scaled, it just neurons that have a higher ranging variable as its input would just be overactive in that model and kind of contribute noise to that model because of it. So how do we actually do scaling? I mean, this is very simple. I think everyone knows how scaling works. You know, simple things like min-max scalars, so that we range our variables from 0 to 1, or Gaussian scalars, which are just based on normalizing your data. Something I like to use a lot of the time is called a robust scalar, because your data may not be normal anyways, which instead of the mean and standard deviation uses the median and the interquartile range. So this scaling issue is fairly easy to solve, I would say, but it's important to understand why we do it in the first place. So the next major consideration is dimensionality reduction. And there are some intuitive reasons for dimensionality reduction, but some of the reasons are not as intuitive. So why do we do dimensionality reduction in the first place? And why is this actually such a, still like such an active area in machine learning research as well? So overfitting, of course, which many people may have heard, is one of the biggest issues in machine learning in general. In fact, so much of what we actually do in machine learning is a way to fight against overfitting, which is really just your model kind of overperforming on your data set relative to how it would or does perform on new data coming in from other sources. And so why does high dimensionality data contribute to overfitting? Well, there are many reasons, but two of the kind of big ones are just that there can be many spurious correlations with your labels. Just you can imagine if you continue to add, say, random variables to your data set, eventually you're going to add variables that are highly correlated with your labels. And so variables that actually have no meaning with respect to your data, no causal relationship with the thing that you're trying to predict or the diagnosis you're trying to make, can just by chance have higher correlation with your labels. And a machine learning algorithm, of course, doesn't know the difference between this variable is actually clinically meaningful and this variable just is randomly correlated with your label data. And we want to find a way to minimize the effect of that or to remove those variables. And that, of course, can be really hard because most methods for dimensionality reduction would be based on correlation because we don't know a priori causal relationships anyways. So those variables can, in fact, end up being still retained once you've removed as much dimensionality in your model as you can. But as you get into more sophisticated methods and as you simply explore kind of different subsets of your variables using different kinds of bootstrapping techniques or what have you, you can at least minimize their influence and reduce the likelihood that they're retained by your model. The other reason, which is related, is that there can simply be too many degrees of freedom to explore in your model. So we can take the example of just a simple linear classification model. When you have n features in your model, you have far more than n coefficients because you're not only exploring or applying coefficients to those n features, you're in fact also applying coefficients to linear combinations of those features. And so you have this sort of exponential explosion of terms in the model that you're trying to fit. And of course, if you have a small amount of data and a much larger number of parameters that you can use to fit to that data, you can end up fitting anything as long as there's enough variance within your features to be able to fit something. So reducing or removing dimensionality from your data set a priori using some kind of method is quite important in order to actually make sure your model is robust in some sense, robust against overfitting, and that when you estimate its the performance of your model on the data that you have available to you, it's actually as applicable to a real world situation as you can possibly make it. So another reason we use dimensionality reduction is to avoid redundancy and irrelevancy in our data set. So in one sense, it's the opposite problem of having these spurious correlations and too many degrees of freedom that allow us to predict arbitrary data or arbitrary labels. Instead, you might just have many, many features that have no correlations or nothing to do with the labels itself. And that just adds in terms of computational complexity, and it adds in terms of kind of confusing the model and shifting weight or emphasis to features that don't matter away from features that do matter. So we want to remove these so that the model can actually focus on features that actually matter and attribute weights to those appropriately. Now, the other issue with having redundant and irrelevant features, I mean, I described the irrelevancy part, but the redundancy part is also important. And that has to do with correlations between the features themselves. So when you have multiple features that actually end up carrying the same predictive information about your labels, by retaining both of those or all of those in your model, you can actually end up overemphasizing that information relative to other information that's only carried by one feature. And so that actually can hurt your model in the end because the model may not recognize that these two variables are telling it the same thing. Instead, it thinks that they're both important, and so you've kind of double dipped with respect to that information, if you want to look at it from an information theoretic perspective. So dimensionality reduction, like I said, is actually still a very active area of research, and there are always new techniques, and there's a whole variety of techniques that can be used. So you know, one method that, well, what we'll use in the toy demo later on is univariate feature selection, which is just using some kind of statistical method to pick features that seem to be the most relevant with respect to our class labels, and thereby just reducing the amount of features that we use to train our classifier in the first place. There are other types of methods like feature combination, and kind of the simplest and most recognizable of these for people with a statistics background is principal component analysis or linear discriminant analysis, both of which transform your feature space into dimensions that are linear combinations of your features, which of course try to capture the most variance in your data in the first place. So that sort of covers both the irrelevancy of certain types of information and the redundancy as well. Both of these methods are not particularly good at handling the fact that there may be spurious correlations with labels, but they do handle the other issues that we talked about here. So we'll cover one of those methods in a little bit more detail when we get to it, but just so you know, there are many, many different ways of doing it, and it kind of depends on your application. It depends on the type of data you have, and since we only have, I think, an hour and a half for this lecture, I mean, to the extent that you might need to use this in your own problems, it's kind of up to you to read up more about it. And just to mention, because inevitably when I give these kinds of lectures, someone will ask me about deep learning. Deep learning has a sort of different way of addressing the dimensionality reduction problem, since with deep learning, you sort of tend to input something like the raw data into your models. In this case, we have images of faces. Deep learning uses typically nonlinear, but it can be linear combinations of the input space in order to actually generate a hierarchy of features. So earlier in your features, you have very simple types of features. Like in this case, we have things that look similar to edge detectors and gradient detectors that we might see in V1, although of course they're not exactly the same. From those, the model might construct a smaller set of portions or features of faces, and then from there, kind of these more face-like templates that it can use to start to identify individual faces. And so, you know, it's just a different way of handling this dimensionality reduction by organizing your features into a hierarchy that typically gets smaller as the model goes forward. And once you are in this classification phase, you actually have a relatively small number of features compared to what you started with in the input phase. But you know, I'll just sort of reiterate here that deep learning is quite outside of the scope of this talk in particular, because there's much more background information you need in order to actually use it effectively. So another point about the need for dimensionality reduction is we have this whole thing called the cursive dimensionality, which you might have heard of, or typically you would end up hearing about at some point if you're working on machine learning. I think back in the 60s, it was originally coined as Hughes phenomenon. And the basic idea here is that more is not better. More meaning more features, more variables, more clinical information, more data in terms of the richness or the breadth of data is not necessarily better. And this seems to be more than just a problem of redundancy and irrelevancy and spurious connections in your data set. The idea here is that basically what happens is, if you can imagine that you continuously add variables to your data, but you keep the sample size the same, basically the distance in a Euclidean sense between data points grows exponentially as you add dimensionality, right? So when this happens, essentially your ability to detect, or sorry, to estimate things like the mean, the standard deviation, and any kind of statistics about your data basically become less and less precise. So the error bounds around those grow too large, just because the distances between points are so large, and your data becomes extremely sparse, right? If you imagine the point cloud of your data. And when this happens, so it's not just that the error bounds around your statistics become large, because the error bounds relative to those statistics and the data points and your clusters and things like that become so large. Basically, it becomes more and more impossible to detect the difference between actual information or features that contribute information and irrelevant features and just irrelevant information in general. And it becomes more and more difficult to identify clusters within your data. So essentially, for example, in our example of healthy controls versus Alzheimer's disease, the distance between, say, the center of your healthy control distribution and the center of your Alzheimer's disease distribution can end up becoming small relative to the distance between two people who are healthy controls, just because all of the distances are so blown up, it becomes, everything just kind of becomes spread out and amorphous. It's, sort of like entropy in a sense, right? So we want to actually find the smallest feature space we can that captures as much information as we can, and that sort of makes everything easier from a machine learning perspective. So, okay, it's good that there's no questions so far. That either means it all makes sense or none of it makes sense at all. I suppose we will find out at some point in the end. So let's talk now about kind of the more, the part about machine learning that people actually think about when they think machine learning, which is the model fitting and prediction. Even though in some senses, this is sort of the simplest and in a way the least important part of machine learning, right? This is the kind of the easy part in a sense, unless you're trying to design new algorithms like this. So like I said in the beginning, I mean, we don't really have time to go over the specifics of how all of these types of algorithms work. There are many, many algorithms. And in terms of applying machine learning, understanding how a neural network works, for example, is somewhat less important than understanding how to use a neural network in order to actually obtain a statistically valid result at the end, and how to handle your data and prepare it for machine learning and things like that. Of course, one would want to know how a neural network works if one is going to use a neural network. But from an applications perspective, from a data analysis perspective, there's, I would say, much more out there in terms of resources for understanding how these algorithms work versus understanding how to use them properly. So that's what we're emphasizing here. That being said, just to kind of go over a few different classes of algorithms that you might run into or use. The first would be support vector machines. I'll talk a little bit more about them in the next slide. This is sort of a type of classifier. Well, it can be used for classification, regression, or clustering. And it has sort of its own way of finding this decision boundary between data points. This is the type of model that we'll actually end up using in our toy demo. And the reason is because it's relatively simple to use, even though it might not be the most intuitive or simple to understand. But it's also extremely widely used and widely popular. There are many libraries for that make them really efficient and easy to use. And typically, once you're in the realm of sort of these I would say more classical machine learning algorithms for classification, support vector machines are not really going to be outperformed significantly by anything else as long as your data are well prepared. So it's typically, I would say, kind of the best bet to as your first attempt at solving a problem anyways. A very different class of algorithms would be decision trees. And actually, decision trees are one of the only classes of machine learning algorithms that don't require feature scaling in particular, because typically they are treating features independently. I mean, not all of the time, but the idea is that you construct, or it constructs on its own, a sort of a decision tree based on feature values that allow you to actually run through the logic of this tree and identify sort of the likelihood or give a classification prediction of which class a data set belongs to by parsing different variables one at a time. So feature scaling is not as important in this case. In some ways that they can be a little bit more complicated to use effectively. So I don't typically recommend them as the first option to go to. And we're not going to talk about them more here, but they're good to be aware of because they can be particularly good in certain types of situations. And of course, neural networks, something that a lot of people are interested in and some people are familiar with. Like I said before, with deep learning, it's outside of the scope of our lecture today. They're much more complicated to use. They're much more prone to, I would say, misuse in a sense. Not intentional misuse, but misuse in the sense of it's much easier to make mistakes in applying them effectively to your data. So I think a lot more knowledge and background in machine learning is kind of required to actually use these effectively in the first place. So I wouldn't recommend them if you're starting out in the machine learning world. So since we're using support vector machines in the demo, I'll just very briefly give the idea of how they work. I mean, it's very easy to find some more detailed descriptions of these online, if you're interested in going into the math, for example. So one of the problems that a support vector machine addresses very directly is if you consider this plot furthest to the right, sorry, that would be the left, right? Yeah. So if you consider this plot furthest to the left, then you could see that for a given data set that's well separable, or it's actually generally true even with non-well separable data sets, you can actually have typically an infinite number of decision boundaries. So the question becomes, what actually is the best decision boundary out of these? And the principle used in a support vector machine is to find a decision boundary that maximizes the distance between the points closest to that decision boundary on either side. So this is called the maximum margin principle of support vector machines. And these points that are closest to that decision boundary are called the support vectors. So they're the ones that kind of the model is using to anchor where it places its decision boundary in the first place. And the rest of the points that are farther away are technically not important, because if you can best classify these points that are close to the decision boundary, then the points that are far away from the decision boundary are, of course, more easily classified, right? So that's how it identifies what is actually the best out of the infinite possible decision boundaries. And one of the ways it does this, I mean, when you have, like in the example on the left, when you have data that are already well separable and you can just draw a line between them, this is a trivial problem, of course. But the power of support vector machines comes from the fact that it can do this even for data that are not separable by just a line or a plane. And it can solve this sort of nonlinear decision boundary as well. And the way it does this actually is by projecting the data into higher dimensions until it can actually find a relatively good hyperplane that separates the data in a linear sense, and then projects that plane back into the original space, which can end up with a nonlinear boundary. Now, this might sound somewhat contradictory with respect to what I talked about before with the cursive dimensionality and the fact that you want to minimize the dimensionality of the problem when you're solving these classification problems. And support vector machines, try to minimize the amount that they actually project into higher dimensions. And there are some parameters that can be used for in terms of how optimal you want your decision boundary to be with respect to the training data versus how robust you want it to be. Similar to the concept of L2 regularization for those who are familiar with it, which is a way to prevent overfitting. And so this practice is, comes with some risk that you overfit simply because you project into higher dimensions. One of the differences, of course, when it comes to projecting in higher dimensions this way versus adding dimensions with new variables is you're not actually adding new variables in this case. Instead, you're using a function to project into higher dimensions. And these functions are defined in such a way that they try to preserve sort of the relative distance between points to some extent in those projections. So it's not exactly a contradiction with respect to the previous point, but when done correctly, it's a useful tool, and well, it's actually called the kernel trick. So we can say it's a useful trick that allows us to kind of get a nonlinear decision boundary, even using linear methods. Not that, just to add on to that, that's not to say that support vector machines are necessarily linear, because this kernel function itself can be nonlinear. Okay, so I mean, I just only very briefly talked about the actual algorithms itself, because what I think is actually more important is how we actually address issues of robustness and validity, which I talked a little bit about in terms of pre-processing and dimensionality reduction, but we'll talk about it a little bit more here. So how do we actually evaluate our whole classification pipeline in the first place? So kind of the main point that we need to understand, and something that I find is kind of the most common place that mistakes are made when it comes to machine learning applications, is we need to understand first that the point of classification is to predict the class of new data, right? So if we don't have new data, which we typically don't in our research environments, because we have a data set that we're using for research, and we're not testing our model on some new data set that maybe a different clinic has. I mean, if you have that situation, then you're very lucky, but most of us are not in that situation typically. We instead need to partition our data set into what's called a training set and a testing set. And sometimes the training set is further split up into a training set and validation set, where the validation set is used to kind of evaluate tweaks to the model so that we can kind of adjust some parameters of the model or how we're doing the modeling in the first place, and then test that on the testing set at the end. But the reason mistakes are made here is because what people end up not doing is treating the testing set as if it doesn't exist. And that's sort of my main message when it comes to, or when I teach my students or whoever how to actually use this kind of concept effectively, is basically the whole point of this is to simulate a scenario where we have novel data that we want to classify and report our classification metrics on those novel data, which means that we should assume for the purpose of our whole pipeline that our test set that we've partitioned from the full data set doesn't even exist. So anything related to model training or feature pre-processing or feature selection or any of that should assume that the test set doesn't exist in the first place, that you're not even going to say, assume that you won't even get the test set until 2 months from now when you've already done all of your experimenting. If you kind of start with that assumption, you protect yourself from making the kinds of mistakes that get a lot of papers rejected. So I would say it's a very important point that is not as easy to get right as one might think at first. So one of the things that complicates this actually is the fact that you can't just randomly partition off some data from your data set, call it a test set, and then not look at it again until the end, because you have no guarantee that that test set that you partitioned off is representative in the first place. We can take the case of EEG data, or I would say most neuroscientific data actually, at least most neuroscientific time series data, where you have this non-stationarity problem. So the actual statistics of your data are changing over time. So it's not only is there no guarantee that your test set data would be representative of your overall data set, it's actually quite unlikely that it would be representative. And so the way that we end up actually doing or addressing this issue is we run our entire machine learning pipeline multiple times. And each time we take a different test set and a different training set. So we repartition our data. We run through all of our training steps and model fitting and everything like that, assuming that that test set doesn't exist. We compute some performance metrics on our test set once we've already done all the model fitting and everything. And then we reshuffle the data, or it's not necessarily shuffled, but let's say we resample the data and repartition it into a training set and test set again, start a whole new model, and repeat the whole fitting procedure and everything. And this way, we actually get now a set of predictions in terms of how well our model performs its classification. And from there, we can actually get a statistical distribution for model performance rather than just a point estimate of model performance. So basically by doing repeated runs of the entire ML pipeline with repartitioned data, we can get a more robust and valid estimate of model performance. And so this is kind of just the first layer of complexity. There are additional layers of complexity then that one must consider. So once you get into the whole practice of then needing to fit or tune parameters that are outside of the model, so-called hyperparameters, and this could be things like when performing feature selection, how many features do you pick? Maybe you want to try different values. When performing what we would call model selection, so that could involve for your SVM, are you using a linear kernel or are you using a nonlinear kernel? These are now different models. Or am I using an SVM, or am I using a decision tree, or am I using a neural network? These are again now different models, and these are kind of things that you're fitting or tuning that are outside of the actual classification model itself. Now you can start to look at things like nested cross-validation. And depending on what you're doing and how you're doing it and your application, this can get more and more complicated. I mean, the basic idea of nested cross-validation is you take that training set from your cross-validation loop and you treat that as if it was your full data set. And so you go through another inner loop of cross-validation. And so you can imagine you end up at the end of the day repeating your machine learning pipeline hundreds or even thousands of times in order to get these kind of statistically stable and reliable estimates of how well your model actually performs in such a way that you're not actually contaminating information from your test set with your training data. And that's basically the whole point. I mean, for different examples or different applications, you might have to do this a little bit differently, but what kind of keeps you safe is remembering that main principle, where basically anytime you're fitting anything, and that includes computing the mean of your data, you must assume that the test data don't exist at all. If you make that assumption, and you succeed in your implementation in such a way that your test data are not used in any sense, then you've kind of protected yourself from that kind of overfitting or that kind of contamination, which can get you in trouble. And so, this can get really complicated, so I won't go into too much detail about nested cross-validation and different ways of doing it, but it's just something to be aware of. And in the toy demo, we'll just go through a simple cross-validation loop that you can follow. And in the paper, you will see that, or the reading for today, I should say, you'll see that we talk about nested cross-validation and how it was done for our example and why it was done that way. And there's also a good paper that's mentioned at the bottom of this slide that talks about, well, basically nested cross-validation or ways to be more robust with your machine learning evaluation, particularly in the context of Alzheimer's disease, but also just more generally, I would say. So, I think we talked about the most important things, but something that, of course, is also really important is now that you've actually designed a good, reliable, and valid machine learning pipeline, what do you actually get out of it in the end? I mean, I talked about having these more reliable statistical distributions of your performance metrics, as opposed to just having a single point estimate, so that you can have a more reliable result in the end. But what are those metrics and what are we doing with them? So, I mean, there are many different kinds of classification metrics. You'll see in the reading for this week, and I would say in many papers that are based on classification, kind of the most common ones are the accuracy and the F1 score. So accuracy is relatively self-explanatory, right? It's the percentage of data points in the test set that you've classified correctly. And when we talk about the distribution of performance metrics, you take the accuracy across all cross-validation runs and kind of compute the mean and the standard deviation, or the mean, the median, and the interquartile range, or something like that, so you have an idea of how accurate your model is. And of course, you would hope that the spread in your accuracy score is also not that high, because if it's very high, then there's a sort of a lack of stability in your classification pipeline, which might have to do with the data. It might have to do with the lack of representability in subsets of your data. So the statistics are changing too much across different subsets of the data. It might have to do with the fact that the potential that your machine learning pipeline is somehow including too much noise in terms of which features are selected, or in terms of how it's attributing weights to the different features. So it can be an indication that there's some improvements that can be made if the variance around your performance metrics are too high. So in addition to accuracy, like I mentioned, the F1 score is also a widely used metric. And the reason for that is it can be a little bit more reflective of actual performance, particularly in the context where you have imbalanced data, or just in the either imbalanced data or imbalanced classifier. So, if you have a classifier that over-classifies as healthy controls as opposed to Alzheimer's disease, even if your data set was 50-50, it might not reflect, or it might give you kind of a slightly too high of a score, or might overemphasize or overrepresent the performance of your models to some extent, which is a little bit corrected by the F1 score. And the difference is much bigger once you look at imbalanced classes. And so when you have imbalanced classes, so like in a lot of clinical data sets, perhaps you have 80% healthy controls and only 20% Alzheimer's patients. then there's some adjustments you can make to these performance metrics. And it becomes more important to look at things like the precision and recall of your data, of your classification results. So precision being, of course, the number of true positives with respect to all positive estimates. So the number of accurately or correctly identified Alzheimer's patients with respect to all of the patients that were classified as having Alzheimer's. And then recall, which is the proportion of identified Alzheimer's patients with respect to the total number of actual Alzheimer's patients. So slightly different metrics, but both kind of reflective of different ways in which the model can be making mistakes. So just to mention, I think in the toy demo, we actually will be looking at the accuracy, the F1 score, the precision, and the recall to kind of take a look at how they can tell you different things. Another thing that's important in terms of actually interpreting your model can be looking at actually which features drive importance. And sometimes in some applications, this is actually more important than the actual classification accuracy or performance itself, right? Because sometimes what we are actually interested in is which clinical features are actually important for identifying Alzheimer's disease. That might be more important than how accurately your model identifies Alzheimer's disease itself, because this can be thought of as a way of hypothesis generation, one might say, because perhaps when you have this long list of clinical features, you might not realize, or a machine learning model that says sex is more important than, say, diet, hypothetically, that might drive some interesting research questions in terms of, well, is that actually true? And if true, what about that makes it so meaningful? So there are actually, several different ways. I would say there's no standard way of identifying feature importance. One method is to actually just use the metric that was used for feature selection, and we'll show this in the toy demo as well. So for example, one way to do feature selection is to actually look at, in your training data, the mutual information between each feature and the class labels. And this, of course, gives you then a score. And those scores can then be used for reporting your feature importance or looking at your feature importance. And one way to do this might be to actually take the average of those scores across all cross-validation runs and to look at, on average, which features are ranked as the most important. A similar metric, which is one that's reported in the paper that we have for this week, is the actual feature selection frequency. So especially for kind of a smaller data set or an unstable data set, if we look at how often a particular feature is actually selected by your algorithm across many cross-validation runs, this itself is an indicator of how important that feature actually is. And then the third kind of main category is just the actual weights attributed to that feature by the classifier itself. And so this is usually or often only interpretable for linear models and for certain types of models, like a linear SVM can do this. With a neural network, it becomes much more complicated, and it's actually not really clear that you can use weights directly. There are, in fact, algorithms that are applied to neural networks that give us a sense of which features are important and even what those features actually mean. A good one to use, the first two are, or all three of them are useful to use. They just contain slightly different information. And so sometimes it's useful to make use of all of these to kind of identify which features seem to be driving your classification in the first place. Just to mention a couple of more modern and more sophisticated interpretability techniques, there's an algorithm called SHAP and a library called LIME. These are sort of widely reported in the literature. They're not necessary to use, but they kind of come up with their own scores for identifying which features are important and for how much they contribute to each class. So these can be things just to look into if you're interested in more sophisticated interpretability and feature importance metrics. So I think we have about 20 minutes or so. And so let's jump into this toy demo in that case. If you have questions, then this could be a good time to ask them. If not, I will get into it now. Let me try zooming into this a bit. So I believe we are making these notebooks available to you guys at some point. So I think what I do is I send it to Leon later on. So you will be able to actually, I believe, I mean, it's not a problem for me. You will be able to use this later on and play around with it, which is what I designed it for.
You can send it to me and Petra, and she will circulate it to the whole course.
Perfect, yeah. So this is just a very simple toy demo for running through a machine learning pipeline and getting our results or interpreting our results. And it's meant to be sort of modifiable for you. It's meant to be, you know, I mean, I encourage you to play around with it if you're interested in understanding machine learning a little bit, playing around with generating different data sets and using different values for some of the parameters here. But let's walk through it a little bit together just so you can see very basically how it works. I would recommend, especially for learning machine learning, to use this Python library called sklearn, which is scikit-learn. So it's pip or conda install scikit-learn, not sklearn, just in case. A lot of people forget that when they're first installing it, even after you've installed it 20 times. It's a very convenient and I would say handy library for kind of making very efficient and easy to understand and read machine learning pipelines. And what I'm showing here is not actually the most efficient way to make these pipelines, but it's sort of the most self-explanatory and the most verbose in a sense, so that it's easier to follow rather than kind of being hidden behind these kind of more wrapper functions that simplify your code a little bit. So in this way, it kind of makes it easier to play around with also if you're not already familiar with these libraries. So in this case, I mean, like I said in the beginning, machine learning can be really useful for analyzing outputs of TVB experiments. But because we want to avoid clinical data and all this kind of stuff, instead, what I'm doing here is just generating a data set using this handy make classification function. And we can pretend that this is, something like what you could get out of a TVB experiment. So for example, if you use TVB to generate some EEG data, you can then take your typical EEG libraries and maybe convert those EEG traces into a set of power distribution features for different subjects or different time periods. And we could say, well, this is now our, at the end of the day, this becomes a machine learning or a classification experiment just like any other. So, if you were going to play around with this, I would recommend, taking a look at this function here and making some changes. I won't go through all the details, but you can play around with, for example, how many features there are, how many informative features there are, how many redundant features, and how many repeated features there are. And these are kind of a few important things to look at because once we start comparing how the model performs with and without feature selection, it can be really important to see, well, if most of my features are not informative, how much does feature selection contribute? And if all of my features are actually important, then how much does feature selection contribute? And perhaps feature selection in that case can actually hurt, because if all of my features are important and I select only half of my features, then we are potentially losing relevant information and hurting our classification. Yeah, and you can play around with how different types of non-informative features contribute. You can change the number of classes in your problem. And this is an important argument here, which actually has to do with how easily classifiable the data is in the first place. So the higher this value, the easier the problem is. And you can see that if you play around with this, that making the problem harder or easier can actually change which particular modeling techniques or methods are actually most effective. So machine learning in some ways, I mean, the machine learning still likes to say that in many ways machine learning is part art, part science, because there's no kind of deterministic way to know how to design your pipeline. What we can talk about, and which is what I emphasized in this lecture, is how to make sure your pipeline is actually valid and robust in some sense, right? Because yeah, different types of algorithms and different types of techniques and tricks will work for different applications. And so that comes with experience, but knowing how to make sure your results are valid is kind of the most important part. I see someone's unmuted and now they're muted again. Okay. Just in case there was a question. So, so let's just take a look at some very basic properties of this data set. We have 1,000 samples, let's say patients, 100 features for each, and the classes are pretty close to balanced. So we're not dealing with an imbalance here, but that could be something interesting to play with. Now, I'll walk through this pipeline a little bit, but of course, I mostly read it up to those who are interested in it to actually go through and try to understand it. The first important step is to kind of identify our cross-validation iterator. So this is what's going to be used to actually do the partitioning of our training set and test set. Now, you can do this manually, but it can be very nice and to have a library that sets this up for you so that, because you can trust that there won't be kind of any overlap between your training set and test set. And so we're going to run through 10 cross-validation steps or loops. And this shuffle split part simply just means that rather than taking off contiguous chunks of our data, we're actually just going to randomly sample our test data for our partitions. So for each of these 10 iterations, we're going to randomly sample 25% of our data and use that as a test set. We're going to, at the end, collect the accuracy, precision, recall, F1 score, and also the model coefficients, or the weights attributed to the features by the machine learning model across each of the cross-validation runs. And now what we're going to do is go through all of the steps I talked about in the lecture. So as we loop through our cross-validation iterator, we start with pre-processing. And like I mentioned, the most important pre-processing step is scaling our data. And like I said, there are many scalars to play with, but here I'm just using the standard scalar, which is just a Gaussian scalar. Not necessarily the best scalar because, if you have data that are very far from normally distributed, it might not make sense to use this, but it's a very standard scalar, so could be useful. One thing that I try to emphasize with this code is everything we do, including our standard scaling, we're fitting this with our training data and only our training data. And this is, it's a small thing, but it can make a difference. It can contribute to overfitting even if it's just 1%. But something that people do sometimes is because they think, well, I'm just computing the mean and the standard deviation of my data set. How much of a difference can it make if I just use the whole data set to do it? Well, it makes a difference, and it matters. And like I said, don't be tempted by thinking it doesn't really matter. Even if all you're doing is computing the mean of your data set, assume that your test data do not exist at all. Always make that assumption and always practice that. Now, so now that we fit our scalar, which really just means computing the mean and standard deviation on the training set, now we can transform our training set and our test set. And now we're just here identifying the labels for the training set and test set. So probably I should have mentioned at the beginning, actually, and I forgot to mention that X are our data, so our samples and features, and Y are our labels. Now, very simply, we're using here our classifier, which is our support vector machine with a linear kernel. And the reason I picked a linear kernel here is so we can look at the actual coefficients or the weights attributed to the features. With nonlinear kernels, you actually cannot access the weights because they're not really interpretable in the first place. And now again, we fit our classifier using our training data and our training labels. And very simply, we get the predicted labels for our test data. Now, when it comes to looking at our metrics, we are computing the accuracy, precision, recall, F1 score using the test labels and the predicted test labels. And we're just appending those into a list across the cross-validation iterations. And in each iteration, we're actually taking a look at the coefficients of that are attached to the features by the classifier. So that gives us everything we need in the end to actually take a look at our performance metrics and our feature importance at the end. But before we take a look at those, I put a second pipeline in here, which is almost the same pipeline, but now we're actually applying some feature selection as well. So in addition to the classifier coefficients, I'm actually also adding the scores given by the feature selector. So there's two metrics that can be used for looking at feature importance in this case. So the pre-processing step is exactly the same. Now before classification, we just add this feature selection step. The feature selector I'm using here is just to select the K best features. Here I set K equals 20. The reason I set K equals 20 is because I made the data set, and so I already know that there are 20 informative features. This is a cheat code that you will almost never have in real life, but since we have it here, we're making use of it. Now here, I'm using the, again, feel free to play around with all of these. I'm using what's called the F classifier function, which is actually just the F statistic that makes use of the class labels. And so this feature selector is based on ANOVA analysis, essentially. So we take our feature selector, we've identified what kind of feature selector we want and how many features we want to select. We now fit our feature selector using the training data. So just like always, we fit with the training data and we transform, which in this case means just picking the subset of features that were selected. We transform the training and the test data. Classification is the same. Just remember to put in your selected features instead of the pre-processed features from before. And we accumulate our performance metrics and our feature importance metrics. At the end, I'm taking the mean of the feature importance metrics across cross-validation runs. You can also look at the standard deviation, but just for the purpose of this demo, I didn't do that. It's something that you can add if you would like to. Whereas for the actual performance metric scores, I'm taking all the values, and that's so that we can actually, in this example, take a look at the spread as well. So when we take a look at the actual model performance at the end, comparing these two pipelines, well, I just noticed I forgot to put a legend here, but the blue is our pipeline without feature selection, and the green is our pipeline with feature selection. So we can see that feature selection helps a little bit in terms of accuracy, not all that much, but it does help a little bit. And the reason it helps is because the recall is much higher. And the F1 score kind of emphasizes that difference a little bit more. Because, and this is something to always keep in mind, accuracy itself is not usually a great metric for identifying or looking into which models are performing better than other models. The F1 score is kind of based on a little bit more information, and you know, it tends to give a better representation of what's going on. But I would say it's quite useful to look at a multitude of metrics because you want to know where the differences are coming from in terms of your metrics. You can also look at things like sensitivity and specificity, which are related to precision and recall. And yeah, and you would see in our paper, I mean, we also report a few different metrics as well. And you know, we only have a couple more minutes, so I'll go through this kind of fast. It's just to show you that we can plot our feature importance. These are the actual coefficients. And something to look at is that, I mean, once you train a model with and without feature selection, the coefficients themselves or the weights attached to the features change. And because we don't have feature names here, it's you know, it's hard to show right now which feature here relates to which feature there. But something that's useful to look at is the fact that most of the features actually have low coefficients when you include all 100 features, which means, or it's an indication that most features are not actually that important. But you'll see that the model doesn't actually identify them as having zero importance. And that's important because this is one of the reasons, like we talked about, where you can get some overfitting, because you can combine a bunch of features that are not actually important and have very low weights and end up with something that's just by chance correlated to your class labels and then contributes to overfitting. And yeah, since we use univariate feature selection based on the S statistic, we can also look at the actual p-values that come from our ANOVA-based analysis. And something that's useful or interesting to see here is if we rank these by the p-values, here I just took the negative log of the p-value just so that the higher values are more important. We can see it basically falls off to close to zero once we get to around 20 features, actually a little bit less than 20 features. And we set up our data set assuming that only 20 out of the 100 features would actually be useful. So this is another, I mean, these two different feature importance scores or metrics give us different kinds of information. One is what the actual classifier finds important. The other is what some kind of statistical approach for ranking your features deems as important. And both can be useful in different ways. So it's important to look at many different kinds of metrics. But the main point of this is just to show that this is how you actually construct a pipeline in a way that your results can actually be kind of more trustworthy and reliable. So that's all I have for today. And I think that's exactly about an hour and a half. I don't know if we have time for questions, but because I'd be happy to stay a little bit more to answer questions if needed.